In the run-up to building healthy communities, a couple of things were clear from the outset. Number one, we are a health foundation with more of a public health and prevention and community orientation. Secondly, we were consumed with the idea of addressing the social determinants of health. What evolved for us was how intricate the matter of community wellness was in terms of issues outside of the health system. Access to quality, affordable housing, access to work and good jobs, access to economic inclusion, schools.
And that was scary for a health foundation, and yet we kept returning back into the system feedback after feedback about where our blind spots were. And that they were saying, we got to figure it out. Even though we're a health foundation, we need to be thinking more holistically and intersectionally.
Health is fundamentally about opportunity. And so our goal was to increase the odds that communities would be able to pursue a healthy life. The context in which people have to navigate, they didn't create. You're born into that context. And that context is man-made and can be unmade or remade through the work of a committed group of people.
People power for us means all-in, unapologetic inclusion, and a real governing for and by the people. And by the way, for and by the people who are actually suffering at the point of injustice the most in this country.
Thinking about power not only as an instrument for change, but also as an end in itself.
It's that building of power, that collective community power, that ultimately was the health intervention. It was that sense that they could work together to hold systems accountable for whatever change they wanted to pursue.
I want to really emphasize it's not something that TC invented or foundations invented. Democracy does not work for the poor and the oppressed. That the whole system is rigged for those who are in power, who are privileged to maintain that kind of status quo in the system.
The pivot for us, and it's an important lesson for us as a foundation, but I think for the field of philanthropy, it was a two-part pivot. Pivot number one was when we showed up in an arrogant top-down way with the community leaders about the 10-year initiative. The second part of pivot is when we began to see the results of a people power investment and the patience behind that. The school discipline battle became the first of those. The experience with young people in BHC was nothing short of transformational for me personally as a foundation executive, and I think for us institutionally as a foundation. The school discipline issue that they raised and the expulsions and suspensions was not something that was on our radar screen as a health issue. I wasn't even aware it was a problem until they described it in the manner that they described it. That it was the system's way of stigmatizing and criminalizing young Black and brown people as early as the school setting. And that was the portal to hyper-incarceration in the country. And so they're coming together to engage in a statewide campaign, which resulted in ultimately in 5 policy changes at the state level on the issue. That was pivot number 2, because that demonstrated to us, wait a minute, this thing actually works. Investing in people power at the point of injustice, at the grassroots level, and supporting their campaign needs actually really does work to transform systems and policies and practices.
But once we had enough consensus to keep moving forward, it stopped being about proving power building, and it started to be about implementing, expanding, and building out the infrastructure for that.
Let me just operationalize a little bit what we mean by pivot to power through the lens of 2 areas. One is the role of philanthropy within the pivot to power, and then secondly, how we invest in communities. So that's what I want to really lift up, that for me as an evaluator or as a learning person, I wanted to really make sure that we're accountable to how we pivot to power. We had to fundamentally rethink our relationship as partners to our community partners and to our community leaders. We had to redefine how success is measured. There was a real qualitative shift at this point where we were hearing from our communities so closely that it's not about the wins, they're important, but the losses are just as important.
So evaluation proved to be a tough nut to crack. I brought the concept of Chief Learning Officer to the board because oftentimes in philanthropy, I think it's probably generally the case, evaluation tends to be the afterthought. And so with the Chief Learning Officer position, it was my hope and intent to elevate the position with direct reporting relationship to me as CEO. Bring evaluation and learning more in the strategy development based on real-time learning with grantees.
It was a big decision for me to come here. I knew that the commitment to learning and evaluation had ebbs and flows. I'd spent a couple decades, my entire career, evaluating movement infrastructure building. I had evaluated organizing. So I knew that the foundation was heading in that direction. But probably what was most important to me was the signaling by Bob Ross that he valued my lived experience, that I had come from a background as a refugee and immigrant and had lived in a community like Watts, South LA, which is one of our sites. And that growing up there, I understood the conditions that created discrimination, racism, and so on.
It wasn't until 3 to 5 years into BHC, and quite frankly, not until the arrival of Han Kao-yu as our Chief Learning Officer, where we began to get some sense of what learning and evaluation would really mean for us in this kind of enterprise. That, again, thinks about an ecosystem of power rather than a pile of grantees, that thinks about transformation rather than transaction, that thinks about systems that are grounded in structural racism, right? And not in a vanilla orientation that ignores all of these major social and civic impediments to equity and to wellness.
There was sort of this, realization, and Han came on around that time and kind of posed the question, which was, is our North Star goal power?
That's when power shifted to being an outcome in itself, that is just as valuable as any of the other outcomes that we're trying to achieve. There was a realization that if we want any changes to be enduring and sustainable, that we have to invest in how communities approach any kind of problem identification, solving, and feeling that sense of ownership. And so it was exciting to be in that moment. The North Star Goals and Indicators was an attempt to streamline and unify many, many different frameworks that we produced. We were very interested in systems change, and so we had the 4 goals: importance of people power and centering community voices, and advancing health. Health happens with prevention, health happens in schools, health happens in neighborhoods. And one of the key indicators of that was being able to leverage resources from public and private sources so that millions come back into communities that have historically been disinvested.
So the best example that I can describe of the impact of building healthy communities on the lives of low-income Californians is the story of Measure P in Fresno. Fresno is disproportionately populated by low-income, oftentimes undocumented people and other people of color, immigrants and refugees from all around the world. When we talked to people, and they were organized by Fresno Building Healthy Communities, this issue of safe parks rose very quickly up the ranks. And they created this campaign called Parks for All and put a parks initiative on the ballot. All of the power infrastructure in Fresno, the Fresno mayor, the Fresno police chief, the Fresno fire chief, the Chamber of Commerce, the Taxpayers Association, the Firefighters Union, and the Police Union opposed this ballot measure saying that they needed to raise money for public safety instead of parks. So they won against an array of power. It's a classic story of people power.
So what are the learnings that came out of the North Stars? It takes time for communities to collaborate, to come together. Another one is an ecosystem mindset. There are a set of relationships, capacities, strategies, composition of who needs to be in which fights, who needs to bring resources to the table, who needs to decide how to use those resources, who has expertise in this geographic area or which systems. We need to be nurturing the next pipeline of leadership so that young people returning back into their communities and becoming the change leaders. Another one I want to talk about is the adaptive learning. It's really important for us in learning evaluation to not sit on our laurels when we come out with reports, but to think about how do we, in our quest to be emergent and adaptive, to create this space where communities feel safe in failing. And then there's collaborative funding, the kinds of partnerships that we need to have with other funders. We need to think about how to strategically use that and then how to leverage others and how to partner with other funders.
So the California Endowment has a mission, a health mission. There are two tools that philanthropy has to get at mission, right? One is charity and the other is change. The charity frame is much easier to make a grant about, it's easier to evaluate. The problem with the charity frame is that it doesn't interrogate the matter of racial equity. The charity frame merely says, okay, our democracy and our sense of capitalism is just going to create winners and losers, and we're here to help the losers get a little more dignity, get a little more food, get a roof over their heads, right? The change frame leads with the question, why does such inequity exist? And so that's the challenge for the CEO that follows me, and I think for philanthropy in general in the years ahead, is we have to constantly, in partnership with the board, re-examine our purpose. Are our resources gathering to the right place with the right kind of partners to enact a social justice and health equity agenda? This is a long haul game, and the stakes are very, very high for those of us who care about social justice and philanthropy. If we are not willing to make a meaningful and important commitment to learning about how our communities can be better equipped to fight these social justice battles, then what are we doing? What are we doing here? So learning and evaluation has got to be as critically important. It's not an afterthought to the strategy, it's part of the strategy. All of that aside, this work is joyful. Investing in young people, investing in grassroots organizations who can be architects of their own health destiny, that's joyful. That's a thing of beauty. It actually works. So the sobering part of this story is tempered by the joy in experiencing what full democratic participation looks like from those at the grassroots level.